Today we have the governor of the state of New York, Kathy Hochul. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to a conversation about the Democratic Party and our future.
Speaking of, the New York Democratic Convention just took place in your state. You're the first female governor in New York State's history to be nominated. What does that mean for you, for New York, for the Democratic Party?
You know, it was a significant milestone. There's a lot of energy, and I really pushed all the delegates and people in the convention hall and labor unions and people from all walks of life to really take one message to heart, that the greatest fear that Republicans have is a united Democratic Party. So we have to go forth and get through our primaries. We have a few of those to deal with, but when we are done, we have to be united, joined at the hip, or else the Republicans really will think they have an advantage. It's a mid-year election. There's some waves and tides and everything else everyone's talking about, but I don't subscribe to that fear at all. So I was very proud to be historic, but I'm not about making history. I'm about making a difference. And what this did, and being introduced by Hillary Clinton, another glass ceiling shedder, was just extraordinary. A lot of energy in the room. Both of us talked about the need to propel Democrats forward because we are the ones who actually care. We have heart. We want to lift people up from their circumstances. And so I felt really fired up leaving that convention, and being historic is great, but it also, all I want to do is make sure that the doors that were shut for so long in our state are open, wide open to all young women throughout New York. And so it was a great day.
I want to move over to a topic that I focus on, especially on my show, on my videos, and this podcast, and that is redistricting. Now, New York's played a huge part in redistricting, especially in a cycle where Republicans have been shameless and aggressive in trying to entrench their own power. And so now the people who gerrymandered red maps to within an inch of their lives have turned around and criticized New York for how it's handled its own redistricting among other states. What's your response to that?
Well, that's very disingenuous, but I expect no less. And what we did here in the state of New York was look at the population trends. It's what you do every decade. I know quite a bit about this. I was a member of Congress 10 years ago, and redistricting made my most Republican district in the state even more Republican. They've had no trouble with the lines in their states, in Florida and Texas and elsewhere. But here in New York, we're playing by the rules. We're looking at our population shifts. And yes, we have far more Democrats than Republicans, and our congressional seats simply reflect that. So we believe that we're going to get through this without any problem, and we'll deal with any challenges. But at the end of the day, what it really calls for is a federal solution to this, instead of putting it up to individual states and just having the same playbook, the same map that we all follow in terms of just the guidelines we're looking for. And also make sure that we're allowing communities of color to have access and representation. It's not just access to the ballot box, which I believe in, and we have to do so much more with the Voting Rights Act, but how about more access to empowerment, because you have a district that reflects the community that it serves. And so I believe in this. We're going to keep fighting for this in the state of New York, and those are just shared democratic values.
And I think it's especially ironic that the same people complaining about redistricting in blue states are the same people who turned around and blocked federal laws that would actually ban partisan gerrymandering across the country. I think what Republicans would like to see is unilateral disarmament by the Democrats.
That's not happening. We know how to fight. We
Good.
play by, we fight fair, but we will fight to the bitter end. Yeah. So don't expect any unilateral disarmament. We don't go into these situations without being willing to take it to the mat, because this is what it's so important. I want to make sure that our communities of color here in the state of New York have the representation they deserve. And the lines are drawn within the guidelines of law, using all the resources we have to get it right. We've done that successfully in New York. And if that means a few more Democratic seats, well, that's how it plays out. We have more Democrats in our state, but we're doing it the right way. And I'm proud of what we did here in New York State, and I'm sure they'll be upheld in court.
New York was one of a number of states that's recently lifted mask mandates that happened in this past week. What's the rationale for doing so? Why is this time different that we can go ahead and take these steps?
We have seen tremendous progress in our state on battling this pandemic. First of all, because New Yorkers took this seriously. This was ground zero 2 years ago of the pandemic. All eyes were on New York City. We saw how hard hit our communities were, disproportionately impacting communities of color, high infection rates, high death rates. Everyone knows the images that are seared in our minds of how our hospitals were overflowing with people. So New Yorkers, when the opportunity came to have a vaccine, we have 95% of New Yorkers have had at least one dose and even higher, as well as getting our young people vaccinated. So they took this seriously. They wore masks when we talked about having mask worn in schools since the beginning of the school year, because as I thought it would not be as controversial, but clearly it was, protecting our kids in schools was a way to get them back in schools, because remote learning was such a colossal failure. It was the best we could do. Our teachers put their heart and soul into it. The parents struggled. But at the end of the day, the kids were not learning properly. So I wanted them back in school. We have a mask mandate in place for kids. But what I saw for the rest of the economy, and I said this was number one job I had just since taking office 6 months ago, protect the health of New Yorkers, but also protect the health of the economy. Our small businesses could not take another shutdown. We have Broadway and tourists and attractions in New York City that people are not coming to. We could not see those collapse because that is part of our identity. So the masks allowed us to get through Delta, get through Omicron, driving our numbers down. And as a result, we now have in New York City a 1.5% infection rate, 2.5% for the rest of the state. So that is what we looked at, as well as hospitalizations. My main concern was always, would we ever see a repeat of those scenes from 2 years ago where we did not have enough hospital space? So we really worked hard to manage this. Once I knew we had enough hospital capacity and our numbers were going down, it was the right time. We'll keep them on in school a little longer. Let me watch the numbers, but all based on science and data, vaccinations, smart masking policies, and that's how you get out of a pandemic.
Now, if the trends continue as they are right now, when do you expect the school mask mandates to be lifted?
Well, what I've said is that right now we're looking at a winter break for children. They'll be back to school after a break on February 28th throughout most of the state. And I'll look at the numbers. And what we're doing is really smart. We're sending home test kits with every single child in their backpack before that break, as we did before the winter break in December. Have parents test the children that Monday morning, March 4th. 3 days later, test them again. If they're negative, and I keep an eye on the numbers, by that Friday, we should have a good idea on how they look. And then, we'll look at hospitalizations still down. That's good. Infection rates still down. No spike after the vacation. I'll tell you one more thing I'm looking at. I'm looking at global trends, because back in November, early November, we're starting to say, well, Delta's starting to abate. We're doing better. Maybe we make some changes. And then November 26th, Omicron hit. It was first identified, first case in New York, December 2nd. And by 2 weeks later, we had to have mask mandates in place because it was just spiraling out of control, like wild. So I'm going to also not be ignorant and ignorant to what could be happening in some other part of the world. But I don't expect that. But I want everybody to know how thoughtful we are. Our Department of Health and my team, we're not doing this randomly. So we anticipate there'll be time in a very short order that children won't need masks either.
Now, we've watched as the Supreme Court has cleared the way for states like Texas to strip women of their reproductive rights, and they're using a bounty law system. We've heard from Governor Newsom out here in California, where I am, that if Republicans want to outsource to some vigilante style system, that basically two can play at that game, right? So does New York intend on doing anything to counteract these bounty laws to show Republicans the danger of these vigilante style systems of justice?
Well, independent of what's happening there, we have already said that we want people to feel welcome to come to our state, to let them know that this is where you can receive all the health care you need. We'll protect you, we'll protect your rights, and to make sure that we have a system that is well known across the state, across the nation, as a place where we protect women's rights. So we'll talk about those other options, but everyone here in the state of New York knows that I will defend those rights to the bitter end. And no matter what the Supreme Court does, no matter what anybody else does, those rights are enshrined in our state.
So speaking of Texas, we just recently watched as another cold front swept through that state, and that left 70,000 Texans without power. And this was after last year's cold front, where 5 million Texans were left without power and 700 people were left dead. And yet in the special sessions that the Texas governor called, it wasn't to pass any meaningful power grid reforms. Their reforms included some loophole where the natural gas companies could just opt out. His priority was voter suppression bills. So what is your message to these other Republican governors like Greg Abbott who are using these legislative sessions and these bills to entrench their own power while the citizens of their state are left out literally in the cold.
Support. I mean, that's shameful. They have to understand that as governors, we have a responsibility to protect the health and welfare of our residents. We've had ice storms, we've had major storms, we've had hurricanes. When those hit, I convene our legislature, I talk to them, I get the resources out to the people who need the help the most. And that is our job as governors. And to take advantage of a session that's back because they're supposed to be dealing with really a real humanitarian crisis when your people are cold and they're left without power, and to abuse that for other purposes, it's just simply wrong.
What reforms have you made since your predecessor, Andrew Cuomo, left to ensure that the environment that he created doesn't come about again in the state of New York?
Well, from day one, I said, we are changing the environment. The culture is changing. And literally by walking in the door, removing people, bringing in a whole new team of individuals who looked at the whole culture and made sure that there was training in place, not just remote training where people kind of click through that they've been trained on sexual harassment or all the training that's required, but in-person training to make sure that there's accountability. Also, the way it was set up before, if someone had a complaint by someone, as we call the executive chamber, whether it's a governor or a staffer, they had to go to that same entity to make the complaint. So we set up an outside law firm. First time ever, an outside law firm, independent of us, is set up to hear any harassment complaints in the workplace. That's a game changer as well. So we have focused very hard on transparency, accountability, because my job, number one, is to restore people's confidence in their government. That's what was so shattered. And the more we can do that as Democrats, whether it's in Washington or at the state level or the local level, let people know we know who we're fighting for. And we're making sure that all women feel that their workplace, whether it's in government or in the private sector, is a safe place, free from harassment, free from discrimination, free from pay disparities. Because as the first governor of the state of New York, this is personal to me. I've been underpaid in my jobs. I know what it's like to struggle and make those decisions about family and career. So I've lived that experience in childcare and all the hassles that women have to deal with just to get their families taken care of. So that's the advantage I bring to this position. Those issues, those young women, they could be me when I was younger. That could be my daughter today. And that's why I'm going to fight to make sure that they feel that the whole culture and the environment has been transformed. And we've already started accomplishing that.
I have one last question here, and I know that you're running short on time, so I'll make it a quick one. And that is that Democrats are facing the obvious headwinds in 2022. Obviously, one major impediment to Democratic victories this year is that we're unable to get a lot done through Congress because of our razor-thin margins and, a Republican caucus that's basically united in their desire to ensure that nothing gets done. That's not the case in New York, thanks to Democratic supermajorities, meaning that New York can be a case study for what's happening when there isn't Republican obstructionism. So how are you and Democrats delivering for New Yorkers? What do you want your lasting legacy to be?
Well, we have a legacy that attacks every major social problem, every environmental problem, and also using the infrastructure dollars that have been freed up. Let me talk a couple things. One is, as a Democratic leader, I truly believe in the concept of shared success. I am making sure that every time I do a press conference and talk about infrastructure dollars to repair potholes or to fix a bridge or to have a new transit system, a connection between two boroughs that have been isolated for so long, I say, well, we're gathered here today. First of all, we thank President Joe Biden for having the courage to bring this idea forward that we could have a bipartisan, or at least a partisan infrastructure bill that gets over the finish line because of Democrats. And Senator Schumer, our majority leader from the state of New York. And I mentioned the members of Congress. And I talked about our state legislators, our assembly members, our Senate. I am able to, instead of taking all that credit as governor, as has happened in the past, I make sure that everyone knows that Democrats are responsible for this. So that's one part of what we do. The other part is to be very bold. My first month on the job was Climate Week. The United Nations gathers in New York, and everyone talks about the climate. We put forth the most ambitious, aggressive climate protection plan that our nation has ever seen. We're proud of that, as well as a $4 billion bond deck we want to get through with the voters this November to give us the money for clean water initiatives and making sure that we have resiliency for storms. We get better with hurricanes in New York City now. My first week on the job, we had 2 hurricanes. So we're ready for that, but also a legacy of accountability, not just building infrastructure, not just protecting the environment, but also taking care of people. We saw that this pandemic brought our healthcare system to its knees. We have healthcare workers who've been put through so much, they're underpaid. We are doing everything we can to bolster that whole ecosystem. $10 billion on the table to address that, as well as making sure we address childcare issues and home health care aids and so many other areas where we realize people have been on the margins for so long and no one really looked at their issues and talked about them. So our legacy will be one of great accomplishment for individuals, but also to support our business community so they can get back on their feet, small businesses in particular, as well as supporting great initiatives for job training and our Jails to Jobs program. So people who are incarcerated see that there's a place that they can go when they return to society so they feel welcome, they've paid their debt, and how do we make sure that they don't end up on that same cycle back in the jails again. So our plan, my first State of the State had 220 plans. We had only been on the job a few months. We got it done. I'm working on a budget right now, a very ambitious budget, but I feel confident with the Democratic majorities that you referenced, we'll get it through. Now, our own party has different opinions on different roads to take, but ultimately we get to the same outcome, and then it's lifting up people and making their outcomes better in life. And that's the difference between us and Republicans. And I'll make sure everybody knows that as we're getting through our next couple of elections. So I'm excited.
Well said. We'll leave it there. Governor Hochul, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.